My name doesn't matter much in this story. What matters is that I was flat on my back in the dirt, with a bullet through my thigh, screaming at a 24-year-old corpsman to leave me and run, and she looked me dead in the eye and told me to shut up. That was the first time Petty Officer Second Class Nora Hale ever disobeyed a direct order from me. It would not be the last, and by the end of that night, I'd stopped being the one giving orders at all. I'm Senior Chief Dale Whitaker, 22 years in, SEAL Platoon Chief, and I've been shot before. I've broken bones jumping out of perfectly good aircraft. I've had malaria in 3 different countries, and I once got food poisoning so bad in Djibouti that I genuinely thought it might be the thing that finally killed me. None of that prepared me for watching a 130-pound medic sling my rifle over her shoulder like it was a purse and start dragging me across open ground while rounds kicked up dirt 6 inches from her boots. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. We were about 11 months into a rotation that was supposed to be advise and assist, training up a partner force in a valley that had more goats than people and more old Soviet rifles buried in the hills than either. Quiet work mostly, the kind of deployment where the biggest danger is boredom and bad coffee. Hale had joined us 4 months in, fresh off her fleet tour, still had that new corpsman shine to her, still called me Senior Chief, with a little too much respect in her voice for someone who was about to spend the next several months watching grown men complain about their feet. She was good at her job, better than good. She had this way of making a wound feel less catastrophic just by how calm she talked while she worked on it, like she was narrating a cooking show instead of packing a gunshot wound. First time one of my guys, a big loud kid we called Tank, took a piece of shrapnel to the forearm during a training exercise gone sideways, Hale had him laughing about his own injury before she'd even gotten the bandage on. That's a skill you can't teach. Either you've got it or you don't. What I didn't know yet, what none of us knew, was that she'd grown up the only girl in a house with 4 older brothers who used to make her play war games in the woods behind their place in rural Montana, and that her father had been an army medic in a war most of my platoon was too young to remember. She never talked about it much. I found out later, piece by piece, the way you find out anything real about a person, not from what they tell you, but from what they do when everything goes wrong. And everything went wrong on a Tuesday. We'd gotten intel that a weapons cache was being moved through a compound about 6 clicks from our forward position, low-level stuff, nothing that should have required more than a squad and a few hours. I brought 8 guys, including Hale, because doctrine says you bring your medic, and doctrine, for once, was right to be nervous. The compound was supposed to be lightly held. Supposed to be. Somebody's intelligence was wrong, or somebody's intelligence was old, because when we came through that gate at 300, there were easily 20 fighters in there, not 4, and they were not asleep. The next 90 seconds are the kind of thing that doesn't play back in your memory in order. I remember muzzle flashes lighting up a courtyard like a strobe light. I remember Tank's voice on the radio, higher than I'd ever heard it. I remember going down hard when something took my leg out from under me, and for a second, I genuinely thought I'd tripped, because pain hadn't caught up to the information yet. Then it caught up. I want to be honest with you about what getting shot feels like, because the movies get it wrong. It's not a punch. It's not even really pain, not right away. It's heat. A specific, invasive heat, like someone poured a cup of scalding water straight into your bone, and then about 2 seconds later, the pain arrives to collect its debt with interest. I went down behind a low mud wall that was doing a mediocre job of stopping rounds, and the first face I saw was Hale's, already sliding in next to me on her knees, hands moving before her brain had even finished processing the scene. Through and through, she said, more to herself than to me, cutting my pant leg open with a pair of shears she pulled from God knows where. You're gonna live, Senior Chief, so stop looking at me like that. Hale, I grabbed her wrist. Rounds were still snapping overhead, close enough that I could hear the individual cracks separating themselves from the general roar. Listen to me. You get up, you get behind that vehicle, and you run. That's an order. She looked at me like I'd suggested something mildly embarrassing rather than tactically sound. No, she said, and went back to packing the wound. I want you to understand something about the culture I come from. In my world, when a senior chief gives an order, especially in a firefight, especially about someone's own survival, that order gets followed. It is not a suggestion. It is not a conversation starter. I had 22 years of men snapping to at the sound of my voice, and this 24-year-old corpsman with blood on her hands, my blood, had just told me no like I'd asked her to pass the salt. That's not a request, I said, and even through the pain and the adrenaline, I heard how ridiculous it sounded, arguing doctrine while bleeding out behind a wall. I know, Hale said. She finished tying off the pressure dressing, sat back on her heels for just a second, and looked at me with an expression I'd seen before on guys about to do something monumentally stupid and monumentally brave, usually right before they did it. Doesn't change my answer. Then Tank's voice came screaming over the radio that they were flanked, that the courtyard was a kill box, that we needed to move now, and I watched Nora Hale reach over, grab my rifle off the ground where it had fallen when I went down, check the chamber with hands that were shaking just slightly, and stand halfway up over that wall. "Hale, get down," I hissed. She didn't get down. What she did next is the reason I'm telling you this story at all, the reason her name is going to mean something to people who have never met her, the reason 20 years of grizzled operators are going to hear what happened in that courtyard and go quiet. But that part, I need a minute before I can tell it right. Because what happened next didn't just save my life. It changed the entire shape of that night, and it very nearly cost her everything. She stood up over that wall with my rifle in her hands, and for about half a second, the entire war seemed to stop just to watch her do it. I grabbed at her leg, missed, grabbed again, caught a fistful of her pant leg, and pulled as hard as a man with a hole in his thigh could manage, which is to say not very hard at all. She didn't even look down at me. She brought the rifle up to her shoulder like she'd done it 1,000 times, which she hadn't, not like this, not with people actually trying to kill her, and she started firing controlled pairs into the darkness where the muzzle flashes were thickest. I need you to understand what was actually happening, tactically, because it matters. Tank and two other guys, Ruiz and a kid we called Preacher, were pinned in the far corner of that courtyard, behind a stack of oil drums that were absorbing rounds like a wet paper bag. Every few seconds, another burst of fire would come from the rooftop to their left, and every time it did, one of them would call out that they couldn't move, couldn't get an angle, couldn't do anything but hunker down and hope the drums held. Hale had seen something I hadn't, flat on my back, with my vision starting to tunnel from blood loss. She'd seen that the rooftop shooter had a blind spot, a narrow window created by a support beam, and that from our position behind the wall, at exactly the angle she was standing, she had a clean line into it. She put 4 rounds through that window in under 3 seconds. The rooftop went quiet. "Move," she screamed at Tank's position, dropping back down beside me like she hadn't just done the single most insane thing I'd seen in 2 decades of combat. "Go, go, go." And they moved. Tank came up first, dragging Preacher by his gear, Ruiz laying down suppressing fire behind them, and for a moment, just a moment, it looked like we might actually pull this off clean. That's when the second wave hit. I found out later from Ruiz that there had been a second structure we hadn't cleared, a storage building on the north side that our intel had marked as empty. It was not empty. 8 more fighters poured out of it, and just like that, the math of the entire engagement flipped from bad to catastrophic. Hale's hands went back to my leg, checking the dressing, her voice tight but steady. "Tourniquets holding, you're not going to bleed out, you're going to be fine." Hale listened to me. I grabbed her sleeve, and this time I made her actually look at me. "There are 8 more shooters and 3 guys with no cover. You are not fine. None of us are fine." "I'm aware," she said, and there was something in her voice I hadn't heard from her before, something underneath the calm, something that told me the corpsman act was exactly that, an act held together by pure willpower. "But I'm not leaving you in the open, and I'm not leaving them pinned. So I need you to hold pressure on this yourself for about 90 seconds. What are you going to do?" She didn't answer me. She just pressed my own hand down onto my leg, hard enough that fresh pain lit up my whole body, and then she was gone, low and fast across open ground toward Tank's position, my rifle in her hands and rounds chasing her the entire way. I want to tell you, I did something heroic in that moment. I didn't. I lay there behind a mud wall with a hole in my leg, pressing down on my own wound, screaming her name into the dark, and I have never in my life felt so completely useless. What happened over the next 4 minutes, I've had to reconstruct from 3 different accounts, because I could only see pieces of it from where I was. But between what Tank told me, what Ruiz told me, and what eventually made it into the after-action report, I've got a picture now. And it's the kind of picture that keeps me up some nights, not because it's horrifying, but because of how close it came to ending differently. Hale reached Tank's position and immediately started directing fire, not as a medic anymore, but as something else entirely, calling out targets, calling out angles, keeping 3 exhausted, bleeding operators organized when organization was the only thing standing between them and getting overrun. Preacher had taken a graze to the shoulder and was struggling to keep his weapon up. Hale swapped positions with him without a word, took his firing lane, and kept both her sector and half of his covered, while he got a hasty bandage on with his one good arm. Then the fighters from the storage building started flanking wide, trying to come around behind the oil drums, and Ruiz called out that they were about to be surrounded on 3 sides. That's when Hale made a decision that, when I heard about it afterward, made my blood run cold, even though the whole thing was already over by then. She left the cover of the oil drums. Not to run, not to retreat. She sprinted alone across 15 meters of open, bullet-torn ground toward a low outbuilding that gave her an angle on the flanking fighters, the same instinctive read she'd made on that rooftop shooter minutes earlier, except this time there was no wall for her to duck behind, no mud brick to absorb what was coming for her. Tank told me later that he screamed at her to stop, that Ruiz screamed at her to stop, that for about 2 full seconds, every one of them was certain they were about to watch their medic die in the open for absolutely no reason at all. She didn't stop. And what happened when she reached that outbuilding? What she did next with 3 flanking fighters closing in and no cover left between her and them, is the part of this story that turned Nora Hale from a corpsman my platoon, respected, into a name that gets said with a very specific kind of reverence in certain circles now. But I'm not ready to tell you that part yet, because before I can, you need to understand exactly what she was risking, and exactly what she'd already lost once before, a long time before that courtyard, that made her the kind of person who runs toward gunfire instead of away from it. Before I tell you what Hale did at that outbuilding, I need to tell you about her brother. She mentioned him exactly once, months before that night, during one of those long, boring stretches of deployment where guys sit around cleaning weapons that are already clean just to have something to do with their hands. Tank had asked her, half-joking, why a girl from Montana with 0 military obligation in her family history decided to become a combat corpsman instead of, in his words, literally anything safer, like base jumping or alligator wrestling. Hale had laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that didn't quite reach all the way up. She said she had an older brother, Caleb, who'd been Army infantry, and that he'd been wounded overseas years back, bled out during a medevac delay because the guy assigned to keep him stable panicked and froze at the exact moment it mattered most. She said it flat, no drama in her voice, the same tone she used to tell Tank his stitches were healing fine. Then she changed the subject and never brought it up again. I didn't think much of it at the time. You hear 100 stories like that in this line of work, and most guys have some version of a reason buried under the uniform. But I thought about it a lot after that night, because it explained something that had been bothering me since the moment she stood up over that wall with my rifle in her hands. She hadn't frozen. Not for 1 second, not even at the very beginning when freezing would have been the most human response available to her. She had moved like someone who had already decided, a long time before that courtyard, exactly what she was and was not willing to let happen again. That's the thing about the people who do the extraordinary stuff in combat. It's rarely the first brave decision of their life. It's usually the 10th or the 50th, made so many times in their head before it ever happens for real that when the moment comes, their body already knows the answer before their mind finishes asking the question. So when Hale sprinted those 15 meters of open ground toward the outbuilding, with 3 fighters flanking wide, and absolutely nothing between her and them but bad luck and worse odds, she wasn't being reckless. She was doing the same math she'd been doing since the day her brother died in a helicopter that couldn't get there fast enough, staffed by a medic who couldn't move fast enough. She had decided, long before that night, that she would rather be the one running toward the gunfire than the one standing frozen while someone she loved bled out in front of her. I didn't know any of this while it was happening. I was still behind that mud wall, pressing down on my own leg, listening to gunfire I couldn't see and screaming a name that couldn't hear me over the noise. What I know now, I know because Tank told me, in pieces, over beers months later, in the flat, unemotional voice guys use when they're describing something that still visits them at night. Hale hit the wall of the outbuilding and went vertical, using a low sill to get an angle through what used to be a window, no glass left in it, just jagged frame and darkness. The 3 flanking fighters hadn't seen her yet. They were focused on the oil drums, on Tank and Ruiz and Preacher, moving in a loose wedge formation that told her they were experienced, not amateurs, not the kind of fighters who'd panic and scatter. She had, by Tank's estimate, about 4 seconds before they'd closed the last of the distance, to a position where they could see straight down the line and end this permanently. She used every one of them. The first fighter went down before he even registered she was there. The second one turned, started to bring his weapon up, and Hale put him down too, 2 rounds, center mass, the kind of clean textbook shooting that comes from either years of range time or something colder and more useful in that specific moment, absolute certainty that this was not a decision she was going to survive not making. The third fighter was smarter, or luckier, and he was already moving laterally when she fired, catching only a graze across his side that spun him but didn't drop him. He returned fire, wild, unaimed, but 1 round found the outbuilding's support beam 8 inches from Hale's head and sent splinters into her cheek, and Tank told me he watched her flinch, actually flinch, the first crack in that composure I'd seen all night. Then she put him down too. Silence for about 2 full seconds, the kind of silence that after a firefight feels louder than the gunfire did. And then somebody started screaming from the direction of the storage building, and it wasn't in a language any of us spoke fluently, but you don't need a translator to understand rage, and you don't need one to understand that whoever was screaming was about to bring more friends. Hale didn't wait to find out how many. She dropped back down from the window, checked her magazine with hands that Tank said were shaking again now that the immediate threat was gone, and started moving back toward the oil drums, back toward Tank and Ruiz and Preacher, back toward me. That's when the RPG hit. I felt it before I understood what it was, a concussive wall of heat and noise that rolled across the entire compound and knocked what little air I had left in my lungs straight back out of me. My ears went to that flat underwater ringing that swallows every other sound, and for a few seconds, maybe 5, maybe 15, I genuinely could not tell you, I lay there behind that wall not knowing if the courtyard still had a medic in it at all. I have relived those seconds more times than I'd like to admit. Lying there, half-blind from blood loss, ears screaming with silence, no idea if the one person who'd refused to leave me was still alive 15 meters away. I've been in combat for 22 years. I've lost guys. I've held guys while they died. But I have never felt as helpless as I did in those seconds, unable to move, unable to see, unable to do one single thing except wait. Then I heard her voice. It was distant, muffled through the ringing in my ears, but it was hers, and it was alive, and it was yelling Tank's name, then Ruiz's, then mine, doing a head count the way she'd probably been trained to do 1,000 times in a classroom that never once prepared her for what it would actually feel like to do it for real, under fire, with an RPG blast still settling dust across the entire compound. Whitaker, her voice again, closer now, cutting through the ringing. Senior Chief, sound off. I tried to answer. What came out was more of a croak than a word, but it must have been enough, because a few seconds later she was back beside me, blood on her face from the splinters, dust in her hair, breathing hard, checking my dressing again with hands that had just killed 3 men and were now, without missing a beat, back to the gentle, careful work of keeping me alive. "You're still with me," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Barely, I managed." "Good enough." She glanced back over her shoulder toward the oil drums, and I watched something shift in her face, some calculation happening behind her eyes that I didn't like the look of at all. "Tank's hit. Not bad, but he's hit. Ruiz is out of ammo. Preacher can barely lift his arm." "So what's the plan?" I said, though even asking the question felt like it was costing me something. "The plan," Hale said, checking my rifle's magazine and finding it nearly empty, "is that I go get more ammo off one of the fighters I dropped, because we are not going to survive whatever's coming out of that storage building with what we've got left." "Hale, no." I grabbed her arm again, weaker this time than the last, but I meant it just as much. "You have done enough. You have done more than enough. Stay down, hold this position, wait for the QRF." She looked at me, and for just a moment the mask cracked again, and I saw something underneath it that scared me more than any of the gunfire had. Something raw and exhausted and terrified, because of course she was terrified. She was 24 years old, and she had just killed 3 people, and watched an RPG nearly take out everyone she was responsible for keeping alive. "QRF is 11 minutes out," she said quietly. "Tank doesn't have 11 minutes if that storage building empties out again. So we wait and we hold." "We don't have enough ammo to hold, Senior Chief." Her voice cracked just slightly, just once, and then it steadied again, and I watched her physically push whatever she was feeling down into some compartment I couldn't see into. "I'm not asking permission, I'm telling you what I'm doing." And before I could grab her again, before I could get another word out, she was moving, low and fast, back out into that courtyard toward the bodies of the men she'd killed, toward whatever ammunition they were carrying, toward a decision that was about to put her directly in the path of however many fighters were about to come screaming out of that storage building with vengeance on their minds. I lay there behind that wall, useless, bleeding, listening to the sounds of a battle I couldn't see, and I remember thinking one very clear thought through all the pain and the fear and the ringing in my ears. She is going to die out there, and it is going to be because she refused to leave me. I was wrong about one part of that thought, but I wouldn't find out which part until the storage building doors blew open, and I heard Nora Hale scream a warning that would end up being the only reason any of us walked out of that compound alive at all. The storage building doors blew open with a sound like the whole compound taking a breath it had been holding too long, and Nora Hale was standing 8 feet away from them with a dead man's rifle in her hands and absolutely nowhere to hide. I heard her scream before I understood what she was screaming about. Contact left, get down." And then the night turned into something I still don't have adequate words for, muzzle flashes pouring out of that doorway like the building itself had opened its mouth, and Hale doing the only thing she could do in that half a second she had, which was drop flat behind the bodies of the men she'd already killed and use them as cover, because there was nothing else within reach. I want to tell you, I remember every detail of what happened next with perfect clarity. I don't. What I remember is fragments, the kind of fragments that combat leaves you with, stitched together afterward from other people's memories, because your own brain was too busy trying to keep you alive to bother recording anything for later. I remember Tank, hit in the shoulder but still upright, dragging himself up over the oil drums and opening fire toward that doorway with the kind of controlled fury that only comes from watching someone you're responsible for get caught in the open. I remember Ruiz finding one more magazine somewhere in his kit that he swore he didn't have 30 seconds earlier. I remember Preacher, one good arm, screaming Hale's name like it was the only word he had left. And I remember dragging myself, actually dragging myself, one good leg and 2 arms, out from behind that mud wall, because lying there useless while she died in the open was no longer a thing I was willing to do, regardless of what my body had to say about it. I didn't get far, I didn't need to. What I saw from that low vantage point in the dirt was Hale coming up from behind the bodies with the rifle already at her shoulder, and instead of retreating, instead of doing the one thing every cell in my body was screaming for her to do, she started walking forward into that doorway, firing controlled bursts, her voice going flat and mechanical in a way I hadn't heard from her before, calling out numbers, calling out positions. Functioning less like a 24-year-old medic and more like something that had been built for exactly this moment and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. 2 fighters went down in the doorway. A third tried to run and made it about 6 feet before Ruiz caught him from the oil drums. And then, for the second time that night, the courtyard went quiet in that specific, ringing way that only happens after violence has finally, temporarily, run out of things to do. Hale stood there for a second, rifle still raised, chest heaving, blood on her face from splinters that had never gotten treated, and I watched her do something I will remember for the rest of my life. She lowered the weapon, looked around at what was left of that courtyard, and for just a moment, just one single moment before the corpsman came roaring back online, I saw the 24-year-old girl underneath all of it, standing in the middle of a battlefield she had absolutely no business surviving, looking utterly, completely alone. Then she turned, saw me on the ground where I dragged myself, and the mask came back down like a door closing. "You are supposed to be behind cover," she said, already moving toward me, already back to work, checking my dressing, checking my pulse, checking everything except herself. "You are supposed to be dead about 4 separate times tonight," I said, and my voice came out weaker than I wanted it to, "and yet here we both are." She almost smiled, almost. The QRF arrived 9 minutes later, 2 minutes ahead of the estimate Hale had given me, and if you have never experienced the specific sound of helicopters inbound after a firefight like that one, I hope you never have to, because it is a sound that gets inside you and never fully leaves. Tank was stabilized. Ruiz had a gash across his forearm he hadn't even mentioned until someone else pointed it out. Preacher's shoulder needed surgery, but he'd keep the arm. And me, I got loaded onto that helicopter with a hole in my leg, and Nora Hale's hand wrapped around mine the entire flight, not because I needed comforting, she would have told you, but because she wasn't about to let go of a patient she'd fought that hard to keep breathing. I spent 6 weeks in a hospital bed after that night, plenty of time to think about what I'd watched happen in that compound, plenty of time to try to make sense of a 24-year-old corpsman who'd killed 6 men, taken shrapnel to the face, and sprinted through open fire not once, but twice, all to keep a promise she'd made to herself years before any of us ever met her. The official report called it exceptional valor under fire. The recommendation for her Silver Star, which I wrote myself, called it something closer to the truth, though I don't think words really capture it even now. What I know is this. I have served with operators who'd been doing this for 15 years, hardened, decorated, the kind of guys who'd seen everything twice, and every single one of them, when they heard the full story of that night, went quiet in the exact same way. Not impressed quiet. Reverent quiet. The kind of quiet that only happens when you hear about something that resets your entire understanding of what a person is capable of when the moment demands it. I asked her once, months later, back stateside, sitting in a bar that smelled like every other bar we'd ever debriefed in, why she did it. Why she stood up over that wall instead of running. Why she went back out for ammunition instead of holding position. Why she walked into that doorway instead of falling back. She was quiet for a long time, turning her glass in slow circles on the bar top. "My brother had someone freeze on him once," she said finally, "just for a few seconds. That's all it takes, you know, a few seconds of somebody freezing, and it's the difference between a guy who comes home and a folded flag." She looked up at me. I promised myself a long time ago that if I was ever the one standing there, I wasn't going to be the person who froze. Didn't matter what it cost me. I didn't say anything for a while after that. What is there to say to something like that? "You saved my life," I told her eventually. "You saved all our lives." "You'd have done the same for me," she said, and it wasn't a question, it was just a fact, stated the same flat, calm way she used to tell guys their stitches were healing fine. She wasn't wrong, but I want to be honest with you, the way she was honest with me that night in that courtyard. I don't know if I'd have had it in me, not like that, not walking toward a doorway that had just tried to kill me, not sprinting across open ground twice in the same firefight, not standing over a wounded man twice my rank and simply saying no when he ordered me to leave him. Some people are just built for the exact worst moment of your life. You don't know who they are until that moment arrives, and by then, it's usually too late to do anything but watch them become it. Nora Hale is still in the Navy, still a corpsman, though she's moved up the ranks since that night, and every operator who's ever worked with her since has heard some version of this story, usually from someone who wasn't even there, usually with details added or changed in the retelling. But I was there. I felt her hand on my leg holding pressure while rounds cracked over our heads. I heard her tell me no when I ordered her to save herself. I watched her do things that night that I still, to this day, struggle to fully explain to people who weren't standing in that compound with us. She never asked for any of it. She never wanted the story told, honestly, and it took me a long time and a lot of convincing to get her okay with me sharing it at all. But some stories aren't really about the person who lived them. Some stories exist to remind the rest of us what's actually possible when somebody decides, long before the moment ever comes, exactly who they're going to be when everything falls apart. I was flat on my back in the dirt that night, certain I was about to watch someone die trying to save me. Instead, I watched someone become a legend.